Margaret Whitmore ruled her neighborhood with an iron fist, targeting anyone she deemed unfit. When she kidnapped 8-year-old mute Lily Chen and left her tied up in a dark forest, she had no idea the quiet girl's father was the state's chief minister, and her perfect world was about to crumble. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The morning sun cast long shadows across Greenwood Heights, one of the most exclusive residential communities in the state. Behind its pristine gates and manicured lawns lived families who believed their money could buy them anything: respect, power, and the right to look down on others. But they didn't know that among them lived someone whose quiet presence would soon shake their perfect world to its core. David Chin had moved to Greenwood Heights 6 months ago with his 8-year-old daughter Lily. To the neighbors, he appeared to be just another successful businessman, well-dressed, polite, and keeping to himself. What they didn't know was that David Chin was the chief minister of the state, one of the most powerful political figures in the country. He had chosen this quiet neighborhood specifically to give his daughter a normal childhood, away from the constant scrutiny that came with his position. Lily was a beautiful child with bright eyes and a gentle smile, but she had been mute since birth. Despite her condition, she was incredibly intelligent and communicated through sign language and writing. Her silence had never been a limitation in David's eyes. She was his pride and joy, his entire world since his wife had passed away 3 years earlier. The Chens lived simply in their modest home on Maple Street, and David went to great lengths to maintain his cover. He drove a regular car, wore simple clothes when at home, and told neighbors he worked in government consulting. Only his most trusted security detail knew his true identity, and they kept their distance, watching from afar. Margaret Whitmore was the undisputed queen of Greenwood Heights Homeowners Association. A woman in her 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and an attitude that could freeze hell, she ruled the community with an iron fist wrapped in fake smiles and passive-aggressive comments. Margaret had made it her life's mission to maintain the standards of their exclusive neighborhood. She measured grass heights with a ruler, counted the exact number of flowers in each garden, and kept detailed files on every minor infraction. Her husband Richard, a successful lawyer, had long since learned to stay out of her way when she was on one of her community improvement crusades. The Whitmores lived in the largest house on the street, a sprawling mansion that Margaret used to host her weekly HOA meetings. These gatherings were less about community improvement and more about her opportunity to gossip, complain, and assert her dominance over the other residents. From the moment the Chens moved in, Margaret had been watching them with suspicion. She didn't like that David kept to himself, and she especially didn't appreciate that his strange daughter couldn't speak properly. In Margaret's narrow world, anything different was a threat to her perfect community. The first incident happened on a Tuesday morning. Lily was playing in her front yard, drawing pictures in a notebook while sitting under an old oak tree. She loved drawing flowers, butterflies, and birds, all the beautiful things she noticed but couldn't vocally express her joy about. Margaret strutted over, her high heels clicking on the sidewalk like a countdown to disaster. "Excuse me, little girl," Margaret said in her syrupy fake sweet voice. "You can't sit there. That tree drops leaves and it's making the neighborhood look messy." Lily looked up, confused. She pointed to herself and then to the tree, trying to understand what she had done wrong. "Don't point at me, child. Where are your manners? And why aren't you speaking? Are you being rude on purpose?" Lily shook her head frantically and began signing, trying to explain that she couldn't speak. But Margaret just saw the hand movements as more defiance. "Stop that nonsense immediately. Go inside and get your father. I need to speak with him about your behavior." Tears welled up in Lily's eyes as she gathered her drawings and ran inside. David found her crying in her room, and through her frantic signing and written notes, she told him what had happened. David's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. He walked outside to find Margaret still standing there, tapping her foot impatiently. "Mrs. Whitmore, I understand you had some interaction with my daughter? That child of yours is incredibly rude, Mr. Chin. She completely ignored me when I spoke to her, and then she started making those bizarre hand gestures. I don't know what kind of household you're running, but in this neighborhood, we expect children to have proper manners." David took a deep breath. "Mrs. Whitmore, my daughter is mute. She was trying to communicate with you through sign language. She's actually very well-mannered and was simply confused by your request." Margaret's face flushed red, but instead of apologizing, she doubled down. "Well, how was I supposed to know that? If she has problems, perhaps you should consider a more appropriate neighborhood. Greenwood Heights has certain standards." The words hit David like a slap. He had faced political opponents, handled crisis situations, and negotiated with world leaders, But nothing had prepared him for someone attacking his innocent daughter. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," David said, his voice carefully controlled. "Lily wasn't doing anything wrong, and I'd appreciate it if you could be more understanding in the future." Margaret sniffed disdainfully. "Mr. Chin, I've been living in this neighborhood for 15 years. I know what's best for this community. Perhaps you should teach your daughter to fit in better, or consider whether this is really the right place for your family." She turned and walked away, leaving David standing there, his hands clenched into fists. Over the next few weeks, Margaret's harassment escalated. She filed formal complaints with the HOA about everything she could think of. The Chen's mailbox was 2 inches too far to the left, their garden flowers were not in keeping with neighborhood aesthetics, and their garbage cans were visible from the street for 30 seconds longer than regulation allowed. Each complaint resulted in official letters and small fines that David paid without protest, hoping to avoid further conflict. But Margaret interpreted his compliance as weakness and pushed harder. She began following Lily around the neighborhood, criticizing everything the child did. When Lily fed breadcrumbs to ducks at the community pond, Margaret accused her of disrupting local wildlife. When Lily drew with chalk on her own driveway, Margaret called it defacement of property visible from the street. The breaking point came when Margaret organized a petition among the neighbors to have problematic families removed from the community. She didn't mention the Chens by name, but everyone knew who she meant. She went door to door, spreading rumors about how families with special needs children were bringing down property values and disturbing the peace. Several neighbors signed the petition, either out of genuine prejudice or simply to avoid becoming Margaret's next target. Others refused, but few had the courage to stand up to her directly. Margaret's hatred reached new heights when she overheard David on the phone one evening, speaking what sounded like official government business. She couldn't make out the details, but his tone was authoritative, and she caught fragments about policy decisions and state resources. Instead of realizing David might be more important than he appeared, Margaret became convinced he was some kind of con artist or fraud. In her twisted mind, this justified even more extreme measures. She began planning something that would force the Chen family to leave Greenwood Heights permanently. Margaret had noticed that David often worked late and that Lily sometimes played alone in their backyard in the early evenings. The little girl would sit by the fence, drawing or reading, completely absorbed in her own world. Margaret's plan was cruel in its simplicity. She would wait for David to be away, then she would teach that brat a lesson, by taking her somewhere she'd never forget, somewhere that would traumatize her so badly that the family would have to move away to help the child recover. The opportunity came on a Friday evening when David had to attend an emergency meeting at the state capitol. His security team was with him, and only the house's basic alarm system protected Lily, who was staying with Mrs. Patterson, an elderly neighbor who occasionally babysat. But Mrs. Patterson fell asleep in her chair while watching television, and Lily quietly slipped out to the backyard to watch the sunset, something she did almost every evening. Margaret had been watching and waiting. She saw the old woman fall asleep and noticed Lily go outside. This was her chance. She crept through the back gate, approaching the unsuspecting child who was sitting peacefully under a tree, sketching the evening sky. Margaret had brought rope and duct tape, planning to restrain the girl and take her somewhere that would scare her badly enough to make the family leave town. "Well, well, little freak," Margaret hissed as she grabbed Lily from behind. "Time for you to learn what happens to families that don't belong here." Lily tried to scream but no sound came out. She struggled frantically but Margaret was much stronger. Within minutes, the woman had tied Lily's hands and feet and covered her mouth with tape. "Don't worry, brat. I'm not going to hurt you much. I just want to take you somewhere special where you can think about how your family doesn't fit in here." Margaret dragged the terrified child to her car and drove 20 miles outside the city to Blackwood Forest, a dense woodland that was known to be dangerous after dark. She had planned to leave Lily tied up for a few hours, long enough to scare her, but not long enough to cause serious harm. But Margaret's cruelty ran deeper than she had admitted to herself. Once she had Lily in the forest, tied to a tree in a small clearing, she looked down at the child's terrified eyes and felt a surge of power that intoxicated her. "This is what happens to freaks and their families when they don't know their place," she whispered. "Maybe a night out here will teach you and your father to find somewhere more appropriate to live." Lily's eyes were wide with terror as Margaret turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the dark forest as night fell around her. David returned home at 11 p.m. to find Mrs. Patterson awake and panicking. She had woken up to find Lily missing and had been searching the house and yard for over an hour. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Chin. I just closed my eyes for a minute and when I woke up she was gone." I've looked everywhere. David's blood turned to ice. His security team immediately launched into action, treating it as a potential kidnapping. Within minutes, they had contacted local police, but David knew he couldn't wait for official channels. He made a single phone call that activated every resource at his disposal. Within 30 minutes, state police helicopters were in the air with thermal imaging equipment, search dogs were on the ground, and every available officer in 3 counties was looking for Lily. But as the hours passed with no sign of his daughter, David felt a desperation he had never experienced before. Lily was afraid of the dark, afraid of being alone, and she couldn't call for help even if someone was nearby. At 3 a.m. Mrs. Patterson remembered something. "Mr. Chin, I saw Margaret Whitmore drive past around the time Lily must have gone missing. She was driving unusually fast and she looked, I don't know, excited about something." David's security chief, Agent Martinez, immediately ran a trace on Margaret's car. Her vehicle's GPS showed she had driven to Blackwood Forest and back earlier that evening. "Sir, we have a location. Forest Access Road, about 20 miles north." Her car was there for approximately 90 minutes. David didn't wait for the search teams. He grabbed a flashlight and ran to his car, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and rage that threatened to consume him. The search dogs found Lily first, their barking echoing through the dark forest at 4:15 a.m. She was unconscious from exhaustion and terror, still tied to the tree where Margaret had left her. Her face was streaked with tears, and her small body was shaking from the cold night air. David reached her just as the paramedics arrived. As he carefully removed the ropes and tape, Lily's eyes fluttered open. When she saw her father, she threw her arms around him and sobbed silently, her small body shaking with relief and trauma. "Daddy's here, sweetheart. You're safe now. I'm never going to let anyone hurt you again." At the hospital, doctors confirmed that Lily was physically unharmed but severely traumatized. She wouldn't let go of David's hand and flinched whenever anyone else came near her. As David sat beside his daughter's hospital bed, watching her sleep fitfully, something fundamental changed inside him. The careful balance he had maintained between his public role and private life shattered completely. Margaret Whitmore had made the biggest mistake of her life. She had awakened something in David Chin that she could never have imagined, the full fury of a father's love combined with the unlimited power of political office. While Lily recovered in the hospital, David's security team worked with local law enforcement to build an airtight case against Margaret. They had GPS evidence, security camera footage from several locations along her route, and her own suspicious behavior as documented by multiple neighbors. But David wanted more than just criminal charges. He wanted Margaret to understand exactly what she had done and to whom she had done it. Agent Martinez approached him with a detailed file. "Sir, we've completed our investigation into Mrs. Whitmore. She has a history of harassment complaints, though nothing this severe. She's filed 63 formal complaints with the HOA in the past 2 years alone, most targeting families she considers undesirable." David studied the file, his jaw tightening as he read about Margaret's pattern of behavior. She had driven out 3 other families in recent years through sustained harassment campaigns. One family had been targeted because their teenage son had autism. Another had been tormented because the parents were an interracial couple. "What about the neighbors who signed her petition?" David asked. "Mixed bag, sir. Some are genuinely prejudiced, but most seem to have signed out of fear of becoming her next target. Several have come forward since Lily's disappearance, saying they want to testify about Margaret's harassment campaign." David nodded slowly. "And her husband?" "Richard Whitmore appears to be a victim too, sir. He's been trying to control his wife's behavior for years, but she's gotten progressively worse. He's actually offered to cooperate fully with the investigation." Margaret was arrested at her home on Sunday morning, 3 days after leaving Lily in the forest. She had spent the weekend in a state of manic euphoria, convinced that her plan had worked perfectly. She had even hosted a small gathering of neighbors, spreading rumors about how the Chin family had finally realized they didn't belong, and moved away in the middle of the night. When the police arrived with an arrest warrant, Margaret's first reaction was indignation. "This is ridiculous. I don't know what you're talking about. That family probably staged this whole thing for attention." But as Detective Sarah Walsh read her the charges: kidnapping, child endangerment, assault, and terroristic threats, Margaret's confidence began to crack. "You can't be serious. I didn't kidnap anyone. I just wanted to teach them a lesson about fitting in." "Mrs. Whitmore, you tied up an 8-year-old child and left her alone in a dangerous forest for over 6 hours. That's kidnapping and child endangerment at minimum. As they led her away in handcuffs, Margaret caught sight of a black sedan pulling up to the Chen house. Several men in dark suits got out, and she noticed they all wore small pins on their lapels, official government insignia. A cold feeling began to settle in her stomach. At the police station, Margaret's lawyer arrived within an hour. Richard had hired the best criminal defense attorney in the state, but even he looked grim as he reviewed the charges. "Margaret, this is serious. They have overwhelming evidence against you. GPS data, security footage, witness testimony. Your best option is to plead guilty and hope for leniency." "Leniency? For what? Teaching a brat a lesson? Do you know what that family is doing to our neighborhood?" Her lawyer stared at her in disbelief. "Margaret, you kidnapped a child. An 8-year-old girl with disabilities. Do you understand how this looks?" But Margaret was still living in her fantasy world where she was the victim. "I want to know who this David Chin really is. Something's not right about that family. Did you see those government cars? I bet he's some kind of criminal and now they're trying to frame me." Her lawyer sighed and made a phone call to run a background check on David Chin. 20 minutes later he returned to the interrogation room, his face pale. "Margaret, we need to talk." "David Chin is the chief minister of this state," her lawyer said quietly. "He's one of the most powerful political figures in the country. You kidnapped the daughter of the chief minister." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She stared at her lawyer, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. That's not possible. He lives in a regular house. He drives a regular car. He said he works in consulting. He was keeping a low profile to give his daughter a normal childhood. Margaret, do you understand what you've done? You didn't just commit a crime against some random family. You attacked the family of the chief minister of the state." Margaret felt the room spinning around her. In her twisted worldview, she had convinced herself that she was protecting her neighborhood from undesirable elements. She had never imagined that the quiet man she had dismissed as some kind of fraud was actually one of the most powerful people in the government. But how was I supposed to know? He never said anything. That's not the point, Margaret. You kidnapped a child. It doesn't matter who her father is, what you did is inexcusable. But the fact that he's the chief minister means this case is going to have national attention. Every news outlet in the country is going to be covering this story. As if summoned by his words, they could hear the commotion outside as news vans began arriving at the police station. The story exploded across every news platform within hours. HOA Karen kidnaps chief minister's disabled daughter became the headline that dominated every newspaper, website, and television broadcast. The details of Margaret's sustained harassment campaign, culminating in the kidnapping of an 8-year-old mute child, captured the public's attention in a way that few stories ever do. It combined every element that modern audiences found compelling: abuse of power, discrimination against the disabled, and the ultimate comeuppance of a privileged woman who thought she was above consequences. Social media erupted with outrage. Margaret's photo was shared millions of times, usually accompanied by angry comments about her cruelty toward a defenseless child. The hashtag Justice for Lily began trending worldwide. News crews descended on Greenwood Heights, interviewing neighbors who suddenly found themselves in the uncomfortable position of explaining their own complicity in Margaret's harassment campaign. Several neighbors who had signed her petition found themselves facing their own social media backlash. Meanwhile, David faced a different kind of pressure. As chief minister, he was expected to make public statements, but as a father, he wanted privacy to help his daughter heal. He held a single press conference, appearing with Lily beside him. She held a sign that read, "Thank you for caring about me," in her careful 8-year-old handwriting. "My daughter and I are grateful for the support we've received," David said, his voice steady but his eyes showing the strain of the past week. "Lily is a brave, intelligent, loving child who deserves the same respect and kindness that every child deserves. What happened to her was a crime, but it's also a reflection of attitudes that exist in our society toward people with disabilities." He paused, looking down at Lily, who squeezed his hand encouragingly. "We will not let this experience define us, but we will use it to advocate for other families who face discrimination and harassment. No child should ever experience what Lily went through." The press conference was viewed by over 50 million people worldwide. Lily's brave appearance, holding her father's hand and smiling despite everything she had endured, became one of the most shared images of the year. Back in Greenwood Heights, the community was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about itself. The story had revealed not just Margaret's individual cruelty, but a system that had allowed her to operate unchecked for years. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor who had been babysitting Lily, was devastated by guilt. She visited David as soon as he returned home from the hospital. "Mr. Chin, I am so sorry. If I hadn't fallen asleep, if I had been watching more carefully." David put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Mrs. Patterson, this is not your fault. You've been nothing but kind to Lily and me. What happened was the result of one person's cruelty, not your mistake." Other neighbors began coming forward with their own stories about Margaret's harassment. The picture that emerged was of a woman who had systematically targeted anyone she considered different or inferior. James Morrison, whose autistic son had been one of Margaret's previous targets, spoke to reporters outside his home. "We moved here 3 years ago and Margaret made our lives hell from day one. She complained about Tommy's stymieing behaviors, said his presence was disturbing to other residents. She filed formal complaints every time he made any noise in our own backyard." The Johnsons, the interracial couple who had also been targeted, shared their own experiences. "She never said anything directly racist, but she found ways to make us feel unwelcome every single day. Constant complaints about our lawn, our decorations, our visitors. She made it clear that families like ours weren't her idea of neighborhood material." As these stories emerged, the HOA itself came under scrutiny. How had one person been allowed to file dozens of frivolous complaints? Why had no one in authority ever told Margaret her behavior was unacceptable? The HOA board called an emergency meeting, and for the first time in 15 years, Margaret Whitmore was not in attendance. Margaret's trial became a media sensation. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and her own statements to police had essentially provided a full confession. Her lawyer's only strategy was to argue for mental health treatment rather than prison time, claiming that Margaret's behavior indicated serious psychological issues. But the prosecution, led by District Attorney Michael Torres, painted a picture of calculated cruelty rather than mental illness. "The defendant didn't snap in a moment of rage," Torres told the jury during his opening statement. "She planned this attack. She waited for the right opportunity. She brought rope and duct tape. She chose a remote location. She tied up a helpless 8-year-old child and left her alone in a dangerous forest for over 6 hours." The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented evidence of Margaret's sustained harassment campaign, showing that the kidnapping was not an isolated incident but the culmination of months of targeted cruelty. Lily's testimony was the most powerful moment of the trial. She couldn't speak, but she had written out her statement in advance, and the prosecutor read it aloud while Lily sat beside her father in the courtroom. "I was very scared in the forest. I could hear animals and I didn't know if my daddy would find me. I kept trying to call for help but no sound came out. I thought maybe I would die there and never see my daddy again. I don't understand why Mrs. Margaret wanted to hurt me. I never did anything bad to her." There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom, including several jury members who were openly weeping. Margaret's defense team tried to present her as a victim of her own compulsions, but their efforts were undermined by Margaret herself, who continued to show no real remorse for her actions. During her own testimony, she actually tried to justify what she had done. "I was trying to protect our community. That family didn't fit in. The child was different. I thought if they understood they weren't welcome, they would leave voluntarily." The prosecutor's cross-examination destroyed any sympathy the jury might have had for her. "Mrs. Whitmore, the child you kidnapped is 8 years old. She has a disability that prevents her from speaking. She had never done anything to harm you or anyone else. How exactly was a defenseless little girl a threat to your community?" Margaret's answer revealed the depth of her prejudice. "Children like that, they change neighborhoods. They make other families uncomfortable. Property values go down." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Margaret Whitmore was found guilty on all charges: kidnapping in the first degree, child endangerment, assault, and terroristic threats. During sentencing, Judge Robert Kim addressed Margaret directly. "Mrs. Whitmore, in my 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a case that so clearly illustrates the danger of unchecked prejudice and entitlement. You targeted a family simply because they were different from what you considered acceptable. You escalated your harassment over months, and when that wasn't enough to drive them away, you committed one of the most heinous crimes imaginable. You kidnapped a disabled child and left her to potentially die in a forest." The judge paused, looking at Margaret with unconcealed disgust. "Your actions traumatized not just your immediate victim, but her father, your entire community, and indeed people around the world who have followed this case. You have shown no genuine remorse, and your testimony revealed that you still believe your actions were justified." Margaret was sentenced to 15 years in prison without the possibility of parole for 8 years. David Chin could have left things there. justice had been served, and his daughter was beginning to heal. But the experience had awakened something in him, a determination to use his position to create lasting change. Within 6 months of Margaret's conviction, David had pushed through comprehensive anti-discrimination legislation that specifically protected families with disabled children from harassment in residential communities. The Lily Chin Protection Act created severe penalties for HOAs and individuals who engaged in discriminatory harassment. He also established a statewide program providing resources and support for families with disabled children, including legal aid for those facing discrimination. But perhaps the most significant change came within Greenwood Heights itself. The entire HOA board resigned in the wake of the scandal, and new leadership was elected with a mandate to create a more inclusive community. The new HOA president was James Morrison, the father of the autistic son who had been one of Margaret's previous targets. His first act was to establish a community inclusion committee and to rewrite the HOA bylaws to explicitly prohibit discriminatory harassment. "We want Greenwood Heights to be a place where all families feel welcome," Morrison announced at the first meeting of the new board. "Diversity makes our community stronger, not weaker." The most important victory, however, was Lily's gradual recovery from her trauma. With the help of specialized therapists who worked with disabled children, she slowly began to feel safe again. David had worried that the experience would make her more withdrawn, but the opposite happened. The outpouring of support from around the world, letters, drawings, and gifts from other children, showed Lily that there were far more good people than bad people in the world. She began attending a new school that specialized in working with children who had communication challenges. For the first time in her life, she was surrounded by other children who understood what it was like to communicate differently. Her teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, was particularly skilled at helping children express themselves through art and writing. Under her guidance, Lily began creating a book about her experience, illustrated with her own drawings. The book, titled My Silent Voice, became a powerful tool for educating other children about disability and acceptance. Lily's illustrations showed her fear during the kidnapping, but also her strength and the love of her father and community that helped her heal. Meanwhile, Margaret's life had completely collapsed. The media attention had destroyed her reputation beyond repair. Her husband Richard had filed for divorce within weeks of her conviction, and her adult children had cut off all contact with her. Her former friends and social circle had abandoned her, and the Greenwood Heights community that she had once ruled with an iron fist had completely rejected her. Even in prison, she was isolated. Other inmates had heard her story and considered her crime against a disabled child to be among the most despicable acts imaginable. But perhaps the cruelest irony was that Margaret's actions had achieved the exact opposite of what she had intended. Instead of driving the Chen family away, she had made them the most beloved and respected family in the community. Instead of maintaining her status as the neighborhood queen, she had destroyed her own life completely. Her former mansion sat empty for months before Richard finally sold it at a significant loss. The new owners were a young couple with twin daughters who had Down syndrome, exactly the kind of family that Margaret would have tried to drive away. A year after the kidnapping, Greenwood Heights had transformed into a genuinely inclusive community. The story of what had happened to Lily had attracted several families with disabled children, who found the community's new commitment to inclusion appealing. The annual community festival, which Margaret had once controlled with military precision, became a celebration of diversity. Children of all abilities played together, families shared stories and experiences, and the focus shifted from perfection to acceptance. Lily had become something of a local celebrity, but in the best possible way. Other children looked up to her resilience and strength, and parents sought out David's advice on advocacy and inclusion. David had also found an unexpected personal happiness. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the therapist who had helped Lily recover, had become a close friend and eventually something more. She understood the unique challenges of raising a disabled child and brought joy and laughter back into their home. Lily adored Sarah and had already begun asking in her written notes when Sarah would become her real mom. The question made both adults smile, and David was seriously considering proposing. The story of Margaret's cruelty and Lily's strength had created ripple effects far beyond their small community. The case had become a landmark example of disability rights advocacy, and David found himself invited to speak at conferences and events around the world. But he was careful to always keep Lily's voice central to these discussions. She accompanied him to many events, her quiet presence and handwritten signs more powerful than any speech. One particularly moving moment came during a United Nations conference on disability rights. Lily stood beside her father at the podium, holding a sign that read, "Different is not wrong." kindness always wins. The audience of world leaders and advocates rose in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. The video of that moment was shared millions of times, and Lily's simple message became a rallying cry for inclusion movements around the globe. 3 years after the kidnapping, Margaret Whitmore remained in prison, serving her sentence. Prison had not improved her character. She continued to blame others for her situation and showed no genuine understanding of the pain she had caused. But her story had become a cautionary tale that was taught in law schools, psychology programs, and diversity training sessions. Her name had become synonymous with the dangers of unchecked prejudice and the abuse of small-scale power. Meanwhile, the Chin family had not only survived but thrived. Lily was now 11 years old, confident and happy in her new school and community. She had learned to advocate for herself and others, using her writing and art to communicate powerful messages about acceptance and inclusion. David had married Sarah in a beautiful ceremony in their backyard, surrounded by the friends and neighbors who had become their chosen family. Lily had been the maid of honor, walking down the aisle with a bouquet of flowers and a smile that could light up the world. The couple had also begun the process of adopting a sibling group of 3 children with various disabilities, expanding their family and their mission of creating a home where every child felt valued and loved. 5 years after that terrible night in Blackwood Forest, Lily Chin Martinez was preparing for her middle school graduation. She had become the student body president, elected by classmates who respected her intelligence, kindness, and leadership abilities. Her graduation speech was delivered in sign language, with her younger adopted brother Marcus serving as her voice. But her words needed no translation for those who knew her story. "Some people think that being different makes you weak," Marcus read as Lily signed. "But I learned that being different makes you strong. What makes you really weak is being mean to people who are different from you." She paused, looking out at the audience that included her father, stepmother, siblings, teachers, and friends. "A bad person once tried to hurt me because I couldn't talk the same way she could. But her meanness brought out the goodness in so many other people. It taught me that there are always more good people than bad people in the world." David watched his daughter with tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by pride and love. The little girl who had been victimized by one person's cruelty had grown into a young woman whose strength and compassion were changing the world. Margaret Whitmore had set out to destroy a family she considered unworthy of her perfect neighborhood. Instead, she had revealed the ugliness in her own heart while highlighting the beauty in theirs. In trying to silence a mute child, she had given that child the most powerful voice of all, the voice of truth, resilience, and unconditional love. Lily Chin Martinez might not be able to speak with her vocal cords, but her voice had been heard around the world. And that voice carried a simple but profound message: kindness always wins, love conquers hate, and every person, no matter how different, deserves respect, dignity, and belonging. Margaret had learned too late that when you attack someone's child, you don't just face that parent's wrath, you face the judgment of the entire world. And sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power to create change. In the end, the HOA Karen who thought she ruled a small neighborhood had been defeated by the love of a father and the unbreakable spirit of a little girl who refused to be silenced.